Enterprise Manager Database Console. In this last nugget, we're going to talk about a really cool tool that's a graphical interface to let you look at your database. We can see the status of the database, whether it's shut down or started up, as well as look at performance both on the database level and on the operating system level. In addition to performance monitoring, we can also perform basic maintenance. For example, if you need to add data files, remove them, modify them, deal with your redo log files, archive log files, modify any of your basic initialization parameters. You can back up your control files. Really, most of the tasks that you can perform on the command line interface, you can do with this tool. You can also clone a database. A clone is just a copy of a database. So if you want to make a copy of your production database to play around with performance, for example, in a lot of production environments, the companies will have a clone of the database to perform testing. So you can perform the clone on the same machine or on the different machine with this tool. And you can also manage your backup and recovery using RMAN through this tool. So if you need to change the scheduling of your backups or see if your last backup was successful, you have a nice interface. Now the tool we're covering here is actually available in 10G. There's also a tool in 9i that was Java-based, but the problem with that was that you had to have the client installed on every machine that you wanted to run it from. What's nice about the 10G tool is you can run it from a web browser. As long as you can ping the machine that's serving up the HTML, you can view all your stuff. Now the reason why I've waited until the very last nugget to cover this is that you're not always going to have access to this tool. For example, a lot of times I have a client that's behind a firewall, and the only way to access their database is through some kind of proxy. Or you might have companies that just don't like to deal with GUI tools. You know how some IT people are just untrusting of graphical interfaces because you don't always know what's going on exactly behind the scenes. This Enterprise Manager makes things really easy for beginners, but it can also be a pitfall. For example, we had this Enterprise Manager installed for a client, and then he called me up one day and he said, you know what, I was an Enterprise Manager and I accidentally clicked the button that shut down the database. I'm like, okay, well, yeah, we need to start up that database again, and please don't do that. When you first create your database, you have the option of configuring Enterprise Manager. So remember when you step through the database creation assistant? Let's go through that real quickly. Remember, you can run DBCA in graphical mode or in silent mode. And here we are. I'm only going to step you through this partially. When you create your database, you'll get to a point where it will ask you if you want to configure the Enterprise Manager. Here it is right here. So that is the default behavior. Make sure you have that checked. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of there. If you initially created your database without installing the Enterprise Manager, you can always use DBCA to then go back and configure it. Now, if you want to see whether the HTTP process is running in the background, you type in emctl status db console. Okay, it tells us that our Enterprise Manager 10G is not running. So we need to say emctl start db console. And it tells us which URL to access this console at. So I'm going to copy that URL. And then I'll open up a browser and paste the URL right in here. Okay, so we're going to log in as sysdba. So I have sys's password there, and connect as sysdba. And just a little splash page. You can look at the licensing information if you want to. And this little tab up here gives us more detailed information about our database. And there's 4 main sections. We've got home, performance, administration, and maintenance. And you can specify how often this page is going to update itself. So we can do manually or automatically every minute. What's really nice about this is as soon as we hit this page, we get a good view of what's going on our machine. We know immediately whether our database is up and running. If you want to shut down the database, you can. It tells us about our listener. and CPU information. For example, if the load is really high or if we have lots of paging going on. And you can immediately know what the database size is in gigabytes and whether there's a problem. So this is really nice for the system administrator at a glance. Hey, you know what? Maybe we should allocate more space. We can tell when our last backup was and whether or not we have flashback logging turned on. Other things we can do, we can scroll down a little bit. We can see things in our alert log. We can see a quick glance at performance analysis. I mean, everything is right there at your fingertips in a graphical interface. Let's look at performance. Now on the performance page, it's going to refresh every 15 seconds unless you tell it otherwise. You can do 1-minute refresh or you can do manual. And this chart here just shows us the activity for a certain time period. For example, 9:10 to 10:05, and if there's any peaks or valleys during that time period. Now, this is a real basic chart. If you want to download the SVG plugin from Adobe, you can do that. We can also look at the active sessions. We can find out what is the biggest hit on the system. For example, is it an application? Is it configuration? Is it a scheduler? Then we can scroll a little further down. We can look at our instance disk I/O as well as our instance throughput. You'll see that we had a little spike right up here. What I find really useful as a DBA is finding the top activity and the top consumers. For example, top activity can give us, for example, the top 10 SQL statements that are hogging the system. And if you scroll down a little bit, this is where we find our top SQL and our top sessions. Who is giving the biggest hit on the database? So it looks like sys was as well as dbsnmp. We can find out whether the SQL type was a PL SQL block. These are the questions that your IT managers are always going to ask you. Who is hogging resources on our database? We can also see blocking sessions. Who is blocking particular objects in the database? We can look at instance locks. Everything that I showed you in the Oracle Wait interface, you can query in this. If you want to see who's logged onto your system, you can search sessions. And you'll see here that we have all the information, the SID, the database user, the service, the client, the machine that it came from, and the operating system user. This is very useful if you think that someone has a session that's just hanging there. Okay, hit my back button. Let's now look at administration. If you want to take a look at your control files, you can do that. If you want to back these up to trace, you can do that as well. And it told me it was successful, and here's the location. Remember, you want to back up to trace anytime you make major modifications to your database, such as adding data files or modifying your redo log files. And we'll now go to the main page again, and here we can look at our table spaces. Quickly, at a glance, you can see the percentage used of your table spaces. And what's nice about this is you can drill down even further. Let's look at our example table space. It tells us information, whether it's read-write, whether it's permanent or temporary table space. And here are the data files that belong to it. And here we can add data files if we want, or we can take data files offline, do all sorts of things. Let's go ahead and add a data file to this table space. We'll call it example02.dbf. Example02.dbf. We'll keep it in the same directory as the other one, and let's make it a little bit smaller. Reuse existing file just means that if there's a file with the same name at that location, go ahead and clobber it. We can tell it to auto-extend. We can also give a maximum file size if we want, or tell it that it's unlimited. We can even click the Show SQL button to see what this is actually issuing behind the scenes. If you want to see all of your initialization parameters or just your memory parameters, you may do that. Okay, the shared pool, buffer cache, large pool. You want to look at your redo log groups? Not a problem. You can even add groups if you want to. So here we've got 3 groups. You can hone in on one of them and see what files are in there. If you want to create one, you can do that. Create it just like this one, just give it a different name. And once again, show the SQL statement behind it. And hit OK. Okay, so our redo log group has been created successfully. If you scroll down, you can look at all sorts of database objects. You want to take a quick glance at the tables owned by particular users. Hit the little flashlight to hone in on the different users. For example, I want to see all the tables owned by Scott. And then hit Go. There we go. Those are his 4 tables. You can drill down to the individual tables and see information about them. Here's the structure of the table. You can see whether or not it's allowed to be null. And if there's a key next to one of these, then it's a primary key. If there's a check, there's a unique key. None of those in this case. And whether or not we have indexes. So sure, you can find all these things from the command line, but isn't this a lot easier? What's also pretty cool is that we have blackout period. A blackout is just a window of time where we're not performing any monitoring on our metrics. Now we can define some yellow and red metrics for our database. For example, if a table space is X% full, then we can turn on an alert. We can define a blackout period just by clicking on that link, and then we can create one. Let's call this weekend maintenance. This will run every Saturday night. We need to enter a reason. You can have a predefined reason or enter your new one. We'll just say weekly maintenance. And whether or not to run jobs during the blackout. You might have jobs that perform backup. I like to turn my jobs off during maintenance. So we scroll down a little bit. And for our targets, we can have not only a database instance target, but you can have maybe your listener be the target. Let's focus on our database. So here's our database. We move this over to our selected targets, and then we hit our next button. And here's our schedule. We want this blackout schedule to be implemented immediately, and we'll do a length of 2 hours. Then we can scroll down a little bit. You know, instead of saying length of 2 hours, you can also give an until date and time if you'd like, or make it indefinitely. Okay, so then whether this is repeating or not, yes it is. You have several options here. We'll make this weekly, have this be every Saturday. So every Saturday at 2 a.m. for 2 hours, so from 2 to 4 in the morning. And we don't specify an end date, so this will happen every single Saturday. Then we hit our next button. And there's the synopsis of what we've got, and then we can hit finish. So you're probably wondering, well, what exactly is Enterprise Manager monitoring? Well, it's monitoring the thresholds that I talked about, like table space usage, CPU usage, whether or not your listener is up or down. Once you have a blackout defined, if you want to define other ones, you can. For example, you might have weekly maintenance or monthly maintenance that are scheduled blackouts, and then you might also have unscheduled blackouts. Let's say something goes awry with your system and you don't want to have monitoring on during that time. Well, just do a one-off blackout. Great, so we can go back to our database. And I went back to the administration page. We scroll down and we look at our Manage Metrics. And this is where we can specify our different metrics. If our archived area used percentage exceeds 80%, that's our warning threshold, then we can define a response action. That might be anything. We could schedule an email to get sent to us. It might be a shell script or a Perl program or a batch script that gets something done. In my case here, I'm going to send a piece of email. In Windows NT, we have a utility, command line utility called map isend. So here we go. And the username that it's coming from is from Julie Johnson. The password is there. Of course, these are all bogus usernames and passwords. The recipient, -R, is jjohnson@test.com. The -S is for the subject line. And then the -T is the text that's going to be sent. That's the body. Okay, so it'll just send out an email that says archive area has reached 80% capacity. And once you set that, then you can just hit OK. Another thing you can do is specify multiple thresholds for particular metrics. For example, if you scroll down to where it talks about table spaces, right down here, table space used percentage. And we have a threshold of 85% and then for 97%. Well, some table spaces are almost full and you really don't care about them that much. For example, you might have a particular table space that's already been filled up and you don't think it's ever going to grow ever again. So it's okay if it's filled up 99%. But then there's other table spaces that are growing more rapidly and you do want to monitor those. So for that type of metric, you would scroll up and then hit specify multiple thresholds. And that's where you can say, look, for the user's table space, I want to have my warning threshold at X% and my critical threshold at X%. Your response action might be to add another data file, or it might be to email the DBA. And so then if you wanted to add more rows, more table spaces to monitor, you can do that. Okay, we're just going to hit cancel here. You're probably wondering why some of these options here are grayed out, and that's because out of the box, the Enterprise Manager doesn't monitor everything. You actually have to purchase extra management packs. One of the coolest features of this tool is ease of maintenance when it comes to cloning a database. So notice I clicked on the Maintenance tab, and I scroll down till I find the Clone Database. What source do we want to clone? Let's just clone our running database, which is ORCL2. And I'll continue. I mean, a clone is just a copy of a database. And if it's on the same machine as the original database, then it has to have a different name. If it's on a different machine, then it can be the same name. So here we need to specify a working directory where all the files are going to be for cloning. And we'll just keep with the default directory there. And we have two choices whether or not we want to retain the contents of the working directory. If you're going to clone a database more than once, then by all means retain all that information. If you're just going to clone it once, choose that option. For the source host credentials, you have to give the username and password of the operating system. Now, on Unix and Linux, you have to have a password for the user. On Windows, you need to also make sure that this user actually has a password. If you don't have a password for the user on the OS level, you won't get past this point. So save as a preferred credential. We just want to say yes, so we won't have to keep entering our information. If you don't have a password, you can log in as the administrator on Windows and go to the control panel and then users, and you can set up your password there. I need to choose a global database name. I'll call it test.johnson. I put in Johnson because that's the name of my machine. And then the instance name is test. I'm using my file system for storage. You have other choices such as automatic storage management or raw devices like tape. And then we have our saved host credentials. If you want to have your destination on a different host, you can do that. Mine is on the same machine, so I'll just stick with the defaults here and hit next. Then for the database file locations, we can stick with the standard optimal flexible architecture, or we can use Oracle managed files, which is kind of a quick and dirty way of having one location for all of your data files. Then our network configuration file location is going to be right here under network admin. Then for your database control configuration, if you want to set up Enterprise Manager for your new clone database, make sure you check this and you enter in passwords. You can also change the port number if you want to. If you have your Enterprise Manager database control running for two different databases on the same machine, they have to run on different ports. Let's hit next. And a job is going to run to actually clone the database. So there's a job name. We can put a description in there if we want to. And if we want to start this job immediately, we can do it, or we can schedule this to happen later. Let's say you have a lot of activity on the database right now. It wouldn't make sense to clone the database. You might already have a heavy load on the system. So we go ahead and hit next. Here's just a splash page of everything that is going to be created, and then we can submit our job. Then we can come back later and see that our database has been created. And after about 30 seconds to a couple minutes, you'll get a splash page telling you that your submit was successful. So then you can hit OK, and we're back to square one. At this point, we can test that the database was actually cloned correctly. So let's open up a DOS prompt and set our Oracle SID to be test. Remember, that was the SID that we defined. And then we can launch our SQL Plus /sysdba, and we're in. Select name from $database. Good. And let's see what the status is of our instance. It's open. We can also verify that our Enterprise Manager has been correctly configured for this database. You can host to the OS level again and just do an emctl status db console. Now it's telling us that here's the URL and that it is running. So we can just copy this. Notice that the port number is 5500 for this database, and the port number up here was 5501 for our other database. So I'll just paste this right in here. And we get our login page for test.johnson. And we'll log in as sysdba. And we're good to go. The last thing that I want to cover in the maintenance section is dealing with your backup settings. Go ahead and click on that link. And it just gives us an overview of our disk settings. We can tell it where we want our backup location to be. I'm just going to say Oracle/backup. You need to make sure that this directory already exists on the operating system level. And you can even hit the button to test the disk backup. This will take sometimes up to 3 minutes. And our disk backup test was successful. Now we can do a normal backup set. We can also perform a compressed backup set. That's where it's reduced in size, however, it does take a little bit longer to perform the backup. Or we can do an image copy, which is just like doing an operating system level copy. The only difference is that this information is logged in the repository for RMAN. If we're going to back up to tape, you can also configure this information. We're not going to do tape backup here. And the media management also has to do with tape if you're using a third-party vendor. And here's our host credentials, and we'll save as a preferred credential so we won't have to be prompted when we're performing the backup. And then you can also define your backup set. For example, you can tell it how large the maximum backup file is. Now, you could configure this all in RMAN when you say show all, but it's also nice to have this as a graphical interface. Here you can have your tape settings, and once again your host credentials. And here we can configure more of our policies. We have our automatic control file and server parameter file backup configured. I'm going to have my auto backup disk location to be also under Oracle Backup. And you can also check to optimize the whole database backup. So this will just skip any read-only or offline data files. Remember, this block change tracking is the new 10G feature, and you specify a file that contains pointers to all the database blocks that have been changed. So basically, you're skipping over any of the unmodified database blocks. And then you can also say which table spaces you want to skip. For example, if we want to skip the example table space, not a problem. So that's our configuration. In this nugget, I showed you how to configure and connect to your Enterprise Manager database console. Remember, to see what the status is, just go to your OS level and type in emctl status db console. If it tells you that your database console is down, then type in emctl start db console. And if you want to stop it, you can just replace that word with stop. Regardless, it's going to tell you what the URL is to access your database console from your browser. So all you need to do is copy that URL and paste it into a browser. We also monitored performance, looking at things such as input-output stats, as well as database throughput, and the top SQL statements that are hitting the database. Then we performed basic maintenance. This is where you can add your data files. You can rename your data files, as well as add, modify, and remove redo logs, and back up your control file to trace. And it's also in here where we can clone the database. Remember, cloning is just copying the database. You can copy it to the same machine or to a different machine. Just remember that if you're going to copy it to the same machine, that the new database has to have a different name, and that your new data files, of course, have to have a different path. And the last thing we covered was managing our backup and recovery. This is where you can set up the parameters such as where your backups are going to go, and how often you want to perform your backups, and how many copies you want to retain with your RMAN. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.